Connor, you can see that the more appropriate award there was the Verve Clicquot Award. I can't decide whether I want to see you or not. Well, here goes. Feel free to take your own glasses off if you want to as well. Thanks, Joe, for bringing me up here, because I'm the most nervous flyer on the planet, and that was the ricketiest little plane. I normally do this meditation thing, and I sit and I pretend I'm not on a plane, but the window was so close to me. And every time that turbulence happened, they were going to fall out of the sky. Anyway, the benefit at the other end was the lovely Geraldine picking me up and the most beautiful airport I've ever been in, actually, so it was gorgeous. I have to say, we spent a lot of this week. I chaired the judging panel for the Restaurant of the Year Awards, like the toughest gigs on the planet, really. But we spent a lot of time talking about these great men and women who become ambassadors for the local area. Nevin Maguire in Black Lion, who single-handedly made that a gourmet destination. JP McMahon in Galway, who's brought the whole of Europe into Galway in a culinary sense. I go to the Women in Media with Joan and Ballybunion every year. Listola is on my diary. Your successor, Dee Forbes, has put Skibbereen on the map with the Ludgate Centre, Paul Flynn and the Tannery. And yourself, they're all blow-ins, actually, compared to yourself. So if we ever had anything as inelegant as a knighthood, I think you definitely deserve one. Rather than the Order of the British Empire, I think it would be the Order of the Irish Republic. Is that a nice acronym? So even though you're exhausted, at the end of a long week, please don't give up. Come back again and again and again. Don't give up. Now, I'm almost from Donegal, right? The egg was from North Leitrim and the sperm was from Dublin. And on a posh day, my mother always says she's from Donegal. She's only a mile inside the border, so she sings the Homes of Donegal in preference to lovely Leitrim any day of the week. So there you go. I'm only just around the corner from you guys. Anything that I say today is really my own. So those of you who do know a little bit about me know I'm fiercely political. I get involved in all sorts of different political issues. Did the outside broadcast for RTE for the Labour Party conference for the last 2 years. I actually ended up chairing both sides of the Shanna debate, one for Enda Kenny and one for John Crown. I'm absolutely agnostic. I've never joined a political party in my life. I grew up in London. My husband worked for the BBC. I was very involved in the All-Party Parliamentary Committee in the House of Commons with Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, and I never joined a political party, nor will I ever in the history of my life. So anything I say because it's my heartfelt view. So first of all, you challenged us with the idea of the terrible beauty is born, and I grew up in and around Yeats's country. My mother kicked us, I think she was trying to get rid of us most of the time, down to that part of the world every summer. And it struck me that I know quite a lot about the terrible bit of that statement. I know too much about the beauty. So when Yeats wrote that, you have to remember he was in England, very safe. And he was gleaning his information from his relatives and his friends back here in Ireland. And he wrote those words about 3 or 4 months after the Easter Rising. But he didn't publish them for 4 years in the New Statesman. And by then, through the prism of time, all the people who took part in 1916 were then heroed. Now, you have to ask yourself, did Yeats really believe what he said at that time? Did he believe that a terrible beauty was born? Was it really about his eloquence and the prose and the beauty of those words, or were they his heartfelt views? Because Yeats, as he neared his deathbed, he kind of had a day of reckoning. Those of you who know Yeats know that he wrote a number of poems towards that period. He died in 1939 in a boarding house in the French Riviera, and he was very harsh on himself. He looked back on the lens through his life and he said, actually, I've told quite a lot of untruths. I was very hard with my words during 1916. The prism through which he looked at his life was not good. And here he is, the greatest poet of his time, a senator, the founder of our National Theatre, a Nobel Prize winner. And his self-critical analysis of his life, what he called a mirage, it doesn't leave much hope for the rest of mere mortals like us who try to live our lives. But it got me thinking about today, about what we're talking about, because the real issue for me is not what did he mean. Thousands of words have gone into what did Yeats mean by those words. But did he believe them? Did he believe those words were true? And do we believe that he believed them? Because at the crux of what I'm going to talk to you about today is the move, the heave, the absolute imperative heave through authenticity and truth in politics. And that is the purpose of my talk. I'll tell you for one, we're going to go back in time to the terrible bit. I grew up in the Phoenix Park. My mother still lives there. We live in a lodge in the North Sickler Road where the Bohemian Football Club was founded. My father was a ranger, so was my grandfather. But you have to go back in time to find out how did we end up in a lodge in the Phoenix Park. My son this evening, while you were all chatting and I was listening to Gary, is plaguing me on the phone. He's 17. He has this thing about opening the fridge. He thinks if he opens it 10 times, something new will appear. Even though I've stocked it up with everything on the planet, and I made him chicken pesto, his favourite, at 7 this morning before I left. There's nothing to eat in the house, right? That's all I'm listening to. You may be debating these big national problems. My son is only worried about there's nothing to eat in the house. I mentioned my son because he's 17. My grandfather was called Norah Casey. He was named after the Fenian poet who wrote The Rising of the Moon 100 years previously. At 17, he took up arms. He went and he stood in Earlsford Terrace, and with a rifle on his back was one of a straggling group of 19 men who walked to Beggar's Bush. The same age my son is now, messaging me saying, "What's in the fridge, Mum? There's nothing to eat." He's worried about his leaving cert and his subjects. And my grandfather, the only person in his family, took up arms at 17, fought alongside De Valera in Boland's Mill. He subsequently was tortured. He was injured at the battle for Ballsbridge. He was imprisoned. Throughout his young life, my grandfather was imprisoned for 2 years in total. First in Frongach in North Wales, and that was during the Easter Rising. Subsequently in the War of Independence in Northern Ireland, and then by his own people for a year in the Curragh during the Civil War. His brother fought alongside him eventually, opposite him in the Civil War, and his other brother became De Valera's aide-de-camp. When my grandfather came out destitute, penniless, incapable of working, shell-shocked through repeated tortures, he had nowhere to go and nowhere to live. He ended up battling the government for 4 or 5 years for a meagre pension. In fact, most of what I know about Norah Casey is because he repeatedly had to sign witness statements. He had to 3 people to say where he was and what he did at every single point in 1916. I'm telling you this because this is the terrible. This is not the beauty, this is the terrible. Then he met my grandmother when she was trying to blow up the line to Belfast. You can tell where I get my dragon tendencies. And there they were now, and their job was to mind the graves in Arbour Hill. They minded the graves of the Fenian heroes, and he lived in a ramshackle lean-to with 3 young children, one of whom was my father. And when De Valera came to office, he gave my grandfather the lodge at the North Sickler Road. And you know what? That man never fulfilled his ambitions in life. At 17, he went into Boland's Mill. At 23, he came out. He did nothing else the rest of his life other than mind gates. Maybe the deer and the cows. And so subsequently, he died a young man. And my father, who had ambitions and was at university, had to leave all his own career behind and come and live in the house so his siblings wouldn't be turfed out. So it defines me. It defines me and all my siblings that happened to us in our lives. I still chase after everything. Everyone knows that I think time is going to run out. If I don't achieve 6 zillion things in my life, I'm never going to be as good as I should be. When I grew up in that park, there were 8 of us in a 3-bed house. I went to a Desh school, Stony Batter. My brothers went to Brunswick Street. I went to Stony Batter. Joan Burton actually went to the same school as me. I'll tell you how unlikely it is for anyone to emerge from that school. When I go in, and I lecture there all the time, they're 12 years old. I go in and talk to them. But at the end of the hall, there's a picture of me and Joan. And, you know, I'm no spring chicken and neither is she. And nobody since then has been put on that bloody wall. So when I say it's unlikely that somebody like me would end up doing something that I did, it's because of that background. My father instilled in us 3 values. Unlike the presumptive First Lady in the US this week, I don't have to make them up because he plagued me with them. Be the best you can be. There was no micromanagement of study and no helicopter parenting. He didn't come in and check on us, neither did my mother, but all the time it was almost the response to every question, be the best you can be. Anyone who's read my book knows that's my own mantra. Secondly, tell the truth. Parents have this uncanny ability to know when your 10-year-old is flustering and lying. So from did you brush your teeth to did you hit your brother first, you told the truth in my house. And if you didn't, you were named and shamed. And our young minds were trained from the beginning, tell the truth. No matter how bad it is, tell the truth. And I drill it into my son. I don't care how bad it is, tell the truth. And the third one was respect. My father was way before his time. He taught us to respect other people, regardless of their differences. And even though we now have a new, wonderful, collaborative society and we accept people as equals, in those days that was not the case. Except my father, he found all sorts of different ways to ensure that we respected others. Mealtimes in the Casey household was the Dáil chamber. My father was a consummate current affairs geek. He collected newspaper cuttings. The radio was on in every room in our house. Thankfully, my husband worked for Radio 4 in the UK, so radio was part of my life. So as soon as we sat down, he called it rising a row. He would start a conversation. The Pope's visit, it could be on anything, divorce. And he would watch us all debate, and he would teach us how to debate. And the most important thing was, do not talk over the person who's speaking. Wait until they're finished. Listen to what they have to say. So my lifelong interest in politics and current affairs was at that meal table in the Phoenix Park with Harry Casey, my father. When I eventually left school, there's a bit of me that was going to do business, by the way. I didn't even know what a businesswoman was. The woman who sold in the shops outside the park gates, she was the closest to a businesswoman I'd ever come across. So I went to be a nurse, an angel, let's say, in Scotland. And then, in my 20s, I became a journalist, in print first in Harlow, then TV and Ealing and with the BBC and radio. So I went from angel to Rottweiler, I think. Later in life, I ended up owning businesses and managing business and investing. And of course, you know that I ultimately became a dragon. I think I'm a nice hybrid of angel, Rottweiler and dragon. Much nicer now. So my expertise in business is strategizing. So when Joe said we're going to look to the future, strategy is my thing. I went to Ashridge Management College for 2 years, studied strategy, got so good at it, went back and did advanced strategic management. And by the way, uniquely human, no other species on the planet can do it. You can do this wonderful thing. It's a supernatural little power hidden inside all of you. You can ping your brains back to your earliest memory, gather all those thoughts, take it into the present, and you know what's the neat thing? You can ping it into the future. You're the only species in the world that can do that. You can actually look to the future and determine a course. You can say, I want to do that PhD, I want to own a sports car, I want to run this event next year, I want to have a big glass of wine later on. So you can have these ideas in your mind and you ping them into these. So strategy is like a muscle that's well honed in my brain. So in advance of tonight, I decided I would look at where all the global trends were going from. So I scrambled out of the valley that you all live in day to day, and I left all of the mundanities of what obsesses us, and I climbed up into that mountain with all the other futurists and had a look into the future. And you know what? There are probably a lot of mega trends and super trends and drivers that you already know about. The increase in violence, the increase in terrorism, economics, climate change, energy, societal changes, depopulation, the shifting sands of geopolitical worlds. So all of those changes all exist, and people like the World Economic Forum and others spend their lives looking at them. But to be honest, of all of those changes, only one struck a chord with me. One that I thought was worthy of us talking about tonight. I'm going to do this through the lens of Trump and Brexit, and do not groan. Okay, I'm not going to bore you. It's going to be an interesting take. Firstly, the trend that emerged this year, people called it an earthquake in the US. A seismic change, right? Because we found this candidate called Donald Trump, an unlikely man who just appeared out of nowhere and is now the Republican nominee. Then, on this side of the pond, we had our own earthquake. They'll never do it, they'll never do it. Oh shit, they did it. Brexit happened. The interesting thing about those two things is it led all those future theorists to say, you know what, there's an end to partisan politics. Even though Brendan and Gary will talk to you about policies, in fact, they're all converging. If you look at everything that's happened since the 1950s, we have a convergence of policies. We almost have an end to some of those cultural wars, which predominated the religious right with the liberal left. Issues around LGBT, around same-sex marriage, even though abortion is dividing the country at the moment, issues around gender equality, divorce, these issues are converging. So the shift towards this new era is something quite different. And what most people call it is nationalist versus multicultural globalists. A new era, a new trend. So you don't need to think too far to know that Donald Trump is a nationalist. It's us, Americans, versus the rest of the world. So his belief is that you build a wall with China, you do a ban on Muslims entering the country. Brexit was also about building borders. It was about saying goodbye to Europe. We're nationalists, we own this space. Usually the nationalist view also comes with free trade. England, UK, is now free to trade with anybody in the world at any price. The same with the US. Globalists Multicultural globalists believe, take down the borders. We actually don't need them. We want to welcome all people into our country. We want free movement of people. So this new paradigm of nationalists versus multicultural globalists brings with us some challenges for Ireland, because we are neither. So maybe because this country was born out of a fight towards independence, riven with divisions in Northern Ireland, we're neither one thing or the other. We don't have borders with Europe. In fact, we open the doors. We don't have any barriers to foreign direct investment. We pave the way. We lure them in to the point where we're now overly reliant on multinationals and foreign direct investment. But then the Eurobarometer survey earlier this year said, what do you think about globalism? 51% said, yeah, we're globalists. A third said they still believed in the European project. But here's the thing, 47% wanted to protect Irish jobs, Irish goods and Irish businesses, not traditionally seen with nationalists. Are you still with me? It's a big thing, I know. But actually that protectionist view that we have and our policies on immigration means we're a hybrid, part globalist, part nationalist. There are a lot of things that Ireland has to face which are the same as everywhere else. Technology challenges, depopulation are amongst the foremost. But there are a lot of differences with our country, save for one, the big issue, which I tend to address. I think that the single biggest challenge that we face with our political leaders, and I'm not making any reference to anyone who's sitting on the panel tonight, is probably the disconnect that exists between what our politicians think and say and what people really believe and what they really say. And this isn't about how often they tweet. It isn't about fixing potholes. It isn't about turning up at funerals, even as my mother would say, you were a friend of the corpse or not. Big debate this week. It's not about any of those things. It's about whether or not they have authenticity. Do we believe what they say? And do they really feel they know us? Is it enough for them to mingle every now and again with the ordinary people, or to claim they know us, for us to believe they really have an insight into our lives? Partisan politics, I've just told you, is receding. Policy differentials are less relevant. They may talk about the flavours and the nuances, but by and large they're gone. A poll conducted towards the end of last year said only 2 in 10 people trusted politicians. And if you think that's always about what Conor said earlier, low morale, it happens every single year. The Irish Times, March earlier this year, only 1 in 10 teenagers trust politicians. And I hear you saying, sure, teenagers never trusted politicians. The Eurobar survey earlier this year, one of twice a year, 80% across Europe said that they did not trust political parties right across Europe. January 2016, an Ipsos Mori poll across the water in the UK showed politicians were less trusted of all of the professions, less than estate agents, bankers and journalists. Only 21% trust politicians to tell the truth. This isn't sudden. The Pew Research Centre has been looking back over the decades in the US to find out why it is that historically we have an all-time low in terms of our confidence in our politicians. Back in 1958, 73% said they trusted the Washington government to do the right thing always, or at least some of the time. By 1964, that had risen to an all-time high of 77% of people. So take that 10 years later, subsequent recessions, it's halved. It's at 35%. It has systematically lowered and lowered and lowered to the point where it's now less than 20%, save for one period that lasted for 2 months. Do you know what it is? October 2001, when they polled after 9/11, and they asked the exact same question, 60%, 3 times more than had previously been the case 1 month previously, said they trusted the government. I'm not suggesting anything, by the way, with our government in terms of improving the trust levels. So the truth deficit is one that we need to challenge. Let's look at why millions of people across the water voted for Brexit. That was not a debate or a discussion about policy. The single biggest Google search terms that happened the day after Brexit was, what does it mean if we leave the EU? The day after Brexit, that was the single biggest Google search term. This was a debate and a battle of belief. Who do you believe? So the Leave campaign obviously won over the Remain campaign. The Remain campaign completely underestimated how disillusioned people in the UK are with a remote, elitist government who feels like they make all the decisions. There was no control. and the punishment was Brexit. The lack of understanding what really matters to people, what people really talk about, led to our own tipping point. What was it? Water charges. Who would have thought that water charges would have become the single dominant issue during the 63 days where we discussed the establishment of the government? The single dominant issue. He says I have 3 minutes. Or I'm out. I'll just waste 10 seconds on a sip. So what we've seen is the rise of the radical individual. Now, so I'm going back to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is patient zero in a new order. Do you know why? He's the first presidential candidate who is not funded through donors, no vested interests. He regularly reminds you, I'm so rich nobody can buy me. Okay, and what is the result of that? It's bizarre, it's abhorrent, it's frightening, because for the first time in our history we have an egotistical narcissist who has so much money he can do what the hell he wants. But you know what's different about him? He repeatedly comes out on top again and again and again as the most authentic candidate in the race. Do you know why? Because when he says he's building a wall with Mexico, I don't like it, it's abhorrent to me, but I believe he believes it. So the interesting thing about authenticity is it alienates people, but it still wins their trusts. So Donald Trump is somebody who has actually broken new ground in the new order. You have to look at Jeremy Corbyn. When I was in the UK, he was the most rebellious of MPs. He says it how it is, warts and all. He may be in trouble now, but that man became leader of the Labour Party. Look at UKIP and Nigel Farage. We may not like it. People believed he was authentic. The move towards the SNP in Northern Ireland, the move towards independence in Ireland, that is all because of disillusionment with party politics and central government. So let me tell you that authenticity can't be faked. It isn't about ducking and weaving. When you see a politician sitting on prime time or on the Vincent Brown show and you see them trying to avoid answering a question, you suspect they're not telling the truth, and even if they're not, you think they are anyway. So authenticity is brutal, it's frank, it's warts and all, and it's quick. If I'm telling you the truth, I don't need to think about it. I'm just going to blurt it out, and party politics doesn't allow politicians to do that. My last thought is we live in a digital democracy, so I'm tweeting tonight. I have 50,000 people that I can talk to whenever I want, however I want. So Donald Trump, he tweets, he sidesteps mainstream media, so does Hillary Clinton, so does the world's celebrities. We live in an era where social media will eventually reach its own tipping point and it'll become mainstream media. And then it will be ludicrous to think that posters stuck to lampposts are going to persuade you to vote a certain way. My boy is out tonight doing Pokemon in virtual worlds on his phone. He's not going to be looking up at lampposts. The eyeballs aren't on the lampposts. And those that don't understand, in the 60s they didn't. Television emerged, and those who didn't understand you had to be slick on TV, they got left behind. Those that don't understand the digital age, they will be left behind in those primetime studios, thinking they're part of some dialogue when the real dialogue is happening online. But it comes at a price. So in the same way that you sit, any of you, in front of a TV and shout, answer the bloody question, the politician can't hear you, social media is not so kind. If you do not answer the question and you fudge it and you try and pretend, they will come back with a very frank and full feedback. So the future will be unfiltered access directly to voters, but the price will be authenticity. In conclusion, I started by quoting Yeats, and I didn't do it deliberately. I did it because I believed that he believed that what he said was true. I absolutely believe that, despite his own difficulties towards the end of his life. When I talked about my father and the values that he instilled in me and how I was defined by my grandfather, it wasn't because I wanted the moral high ground. It's because I believe that all of you in this room, including the people who share the platform with me, were embedded with their own values. They didn't lose them because they decided to become politicians. The worst thing I say tonight is going to be this. Some of my best friends are politicians. I know. But I'll tell you something. Not one of them ever went into politics with anything other than the best of intentions. They all had a belief that they would change society, that they would do good. And I don't know what happened to them, but their personalities split after they got elected. There was the public persona and the wonderful, beautiful private persona. There is a Hogwarts school for politicians that they all go to. It's invisible, but it trains them to avoid questions and to speak in gobbledygook. And I'm telling them, for the future, it's a simple message. Be you. In your heart of hearts, tell us what you really think. I don't care if I disagree with you. You have to be authentic. The new order is about being true and allowing yourself to be brave and courageous to tell us the truth. Thank you for listening to me.